We continue the quest to find out more about the final frontier of space. When President Kennedy challenged us to go to the moon and back, could he have imagined where we are now? We have former astronaut Ron Garan with us today to discuss, well, space. Today on the BizPo Show. Welcome to the BizPo Show. Boy, I gotta tell you, Seth, I am so excited about our show today. You know we have a special guest. What are your thoughts on that?
We don't even need another show. We just need this interview. I can't wait for it because, again, I don't know about you, Dan. When I was a kid, it was about being an astronaut or a fighter pilot or, someone in the military. All these, jobs and things that you wanted to do with your life. Our guest has done them all. We've had on the BizPo Show here the opportunity to interview some amazing people. Obviously, our first guest, Governor Chris Christie. We've had people like Kevin Walling, Siri Kim. The list goes on and on of these fantastic guests. Less than 500 people have ever been into space. And we're going to have one of them who spent lots of time in space on the show today. And that's just, very exciting.
Well, Seth, listen. If you go back and talk to some of my teachers in elementary school, high school, and so on, they'll tell you that I have spent an enormous time in space. So, well, although he's in a different space.
Yeah, listen, I think I'm going to totally geek out today. I hope everybody's okay with that. But the other thing listen, we're still the BizPo Show, right? And it was interesting. We were thinking about it before the show, right? Business integration into space. If you don't think the space frontier is specifically involved in the business sector and vice versa, boy, are you mistaken. A SpaceX satellite. How's your GPS system working? What about that television you're watching every night? Or hey, you're watching us. All of this has to do with space. It is the next big business frontier.
Yeah, it totally is, Seth. And I think that and it's going to be great to talk to Ron about this. I don't think that we necessarily connect the dots, rather, with what they're doing with NASA and all the technology and the advancements that they're making and how that impacts our everyday life, how it's advanced, how we do business as we move towards business at the speed of thought. And of course, BizPo Show, everything involves politics. And I'm going to be curious to see what Ron has to say about how politics impact the space program, because it's got to have an impact.
Well, it's got a massive impact, right? Listen, politics is where the political space is where the space started. It's where it continues. As we start to think about national security, all of that, it begins and ends in space, really. Even former President Trump started Space Force, recognizing that is kind of a place that we need to be focused on. So maybe we'll get Ron's thoughts on that as well. But, listen, again, I think that you have to understand with everything that's going on in technology, from developments, just with everyday things that we have every day, I think we oftentimes don't recognize space's connection to our everyday lives. And so it's an important part of what we're going to talk about today. Also, Ron's got a new book coming out, so you're going to want to stay tuned because you're going to be able to get a copy of the book and get a significant discount by using a promo code that he's provided our viewers, BizPo. We'll have that link available to you, but nonetheless, you're in for a treat for the next few minutes.
Absolutely. So when we come back, we will have former astronaut Ron Garan here on the BizPo Show. Welcome back. Today we have just an incredible guest here on the BizPo Show. We have Ron Garan. He's a former NASA astronaut. He's a former Air Force fighter pilot. He's a decorated Desert Storm veteran. And he's also the author of the forthcoming book, Floating in Darkness. And we're going to talk about that some more. So Ron spent 178 days in space, traveled more than 71 million miles, and he had 2,842 orbits around the Earth. So welcome, Ron, and thank you for your service to our country and to the world.
So thanks, Dan. Hi, Dan. Hey, Seth. Thanks for having me on. I really appreciate it.
We are thrilled to have you, Ron. So, look, we're going to jump into the questions and I'll get things going. So, as a country, we put a lot of time and resources into our space program. And I'd like to ask you, because I think a lot of people are curious about this, me included. How does the space program benefit the United States, the world, and society as a whole? And to add to that, is there economic benefit for us related to the space program?
Yeah, that's a great question, Dan. I think it would take about a 6-hour segment to go into all of that. But I truly believe that our investment in the space program is the best investment that we can make in our future. And, we've had decades of talking about spin-off technology, spin-off benefits of the space program, whether that's solar power or computers or miniaturization of electronics, medical breakthroughs, the list goes on and on. But now with the advent of the International Space Station, which has been continuously operated by humans for the last 20 plus years, we have a national laboratory on board the International Space Station. And research is being conducted on board that laboratory that simply can't be done anywhere else. And so we're looking at things like how we can improve fuel efficiency, how we can improve agricultural yields, how can we get a better understanding of the human body and develop medicines, and the list goes on and on with direct, tangible benefits to the inhabitants of Earth from the research that's being conducted on board the International Space Station. But the benefits go on and on. There's tremendous benefits towards education and inspires students to excel, and inspires students to study STEM type topics. There's resources in space that can benefit the Earth. There's economic benefits in space that could benefit the Earth. And one of the things, we don't launch money into space. All the money that's spent on the space program is spent right here on the ground, and it helps boost the industries, those technological industries that are designing the next generation of spacecraft.
Just incredible. And as you know, Ron, the BizPo show is about business and politics. So we always try to weave those topics into our discussion. So we kind of touched on the business of space a little bit there. I want to talk about perhaps the politics. So, politics is deeply entrenched in basically everything, including scientists' work life. So, related to funding and cultural lobbies, personal bias, all these things. So what does politics mean related to the objective ideals of the space program?
Yeah, the space program, the U.S. space program, is maybe entirely dependent is too strong a word, but it's certainly very heavily dependent on political will, on what the political direction is in the nation at the time. And part of the problem, and what NASA in particular has had to deal with, is normally when there's a change of administration, there's a complete overhaul of our space policy and our space objectives. And that just doesn't work because there's more than a 4-year or 8-year time horizon on these programs. And so many programs get canceled when a new administration comes into office. And so I don't think that's going to happen this time on this change, because it looks like we're still on track for Artemis and to return to the moon, this time to stay and to set up a permanent human presence on the moon. That was actually something that's been turned on and turned off a number of times. George W. Bush had a lunar program. It got shut down under Obama, started again under the Trump administration, and it looks like it's going to continue. And so, I think NASA in particular is very dependent on the political will of the nation and the taxpayers, obviously.
Ron, I have to tell you, when we're so excited to have you as a guest. Dan was just reading your resume at the top of this. I'm sitting there going, "Yep, wanted to be that when I was a kid. Yep, wanted to be that when I was a kid. Yep, wanted to be that when I was a kid." I think the only thing I ultimately did that you and I have both done, I wrote a book too. But so maybe tell us a little bit about this new book. And this is not your first book, right?
No, it's kind of a sequel to my first book, which is called The Orbital Perspective. This book is called Floating in Darkness: A Journey of Evolution, and in it, I make the point that we are at a critical crossroads. We're at an inflection point, a unique inflection point, unlike anything in human history, and it's critical that we make sure that we get on the right path. And so, the literary tool that I use is an autobiographical narrative to serve as a metaphor for the evolution of society, not only where we've been, but where we need to go. And so I took key events in my life. I fought in combat. I had to eject from an F-16 less than a second before I would have been killed. I lived on the bottom of the ocean. I flew in space. I did 4 spacewalks, and many other things that together I've been able to use as metaphors or an allegory for the evolution of society. And I'm really, really excited about it. It comes out May 4th, and I think it contains a message that the world needs to hear at this really critical moment in time.
That's fantastic, and I want to appreciate what you've done for our viewers, which has provided them with an opportunity to get a 15% discount off of the book. So we'll make sure that the link is there, but it's floatingindarkness.com/order, and you can pre-order that now. And using the code BizPo as the promo code will get you 15% off that book. So that's fantastic. We appreciate that.
That's right.
Well, shifting gears, President Trump made headlines early on in his presidency. We talked about and formed the Space Force, right, to better address American military needs for satellite safety and, frankly, possibly even war in space, right? I know we made movies about that, but could be the future frontier. What are your thoughts on Space Force and the protection and flow of digital information?
Well, generally, I'm against any added bureaucracy because I think that a significant percentage of the DoD's budget goes to bureaucracy, and a lot of that bureaucracy is duplication of effort. We've got all these different services. There has been a move over the last couple of decades to do things jointly, to have joint efforts in a attempt to try and overcome some of this bureaucracy, but there is a lot of waste, and I understand why it was done. I'm not, we had U.S. Air Force Space Command that was doing pretty much everything that Space Force is doing right now. The argument is that if you make it a separate force, and this is such an important theater of operations, if you will, that more attention can be put on that, and more room for growth. But putting another service in the mix means one more service that's going to fight over limited resources, or I should say finite resources, not limited resources, and which could potentially lead to duplication of effort, and which could be wasteful. So we have to strike a really good balance with that, with the added attention that a separate force could bring towards the space theater of operation. The other thing is the other point is that it could be seen as antagonistic, right? This is the first military space force in history. Will it spur the development of other space forces? Will it, start an escalation of militarization of space? That's a potential too that needs to be carefully looked at and carefully balanced with everything that we're doing.
Well, to that end, right, just recently China and Russia announced a joint partnership to create a lunar research base. And of course, I immediately went to the fact that China did something very similar, creating research stations in the South China Sea, and then militarized them for denial of navigation purposes and expanding their own territory. Only the power of the U.S. Navy has been able to continue allowing us to sail there. So do you predict that as we think about space and this new joint engagement between China and Russia, that we may be in similar territory up there?
It's interesting about the research centers that they developed in the South China Sea that the Chinese developed. I don't know if they were open to other nations to participate. But if they were, it would be interesting to see what would happen there. And this is reminiscent of back in the early 90s when the Space Station Freedom program transitioned to what became the International Space Station. And at the time, there was talk of bringing the Russians into that partnership. And there was quite a bit of detractors from that. The argument went, the Russians are doing X, Y, and Z, and until they stop doing X, Y, and Z, we shouldn't do any business with them. But those voices didn't win out, and the voices that did win out were, "Hey, the Soviet Union has collapsed. We've got all these rocket scientists. We want to keep them busy. we don't want them going and exporting ICBM technology to nations that would do harm to the U.S. Let's bring them into the program." And the Chinese are going to do amazing things in space, and they're going to do them with or without us. But if they do them with us, not only will we know what they're doing, but we'll have an insight into why they're doing it. And so going back to the International Space Station program, when we brought the Russians into the program, they became an integral member of the International Space Station partnership. Certain personal relationships developed, a certain platform of trust developed within that program. And that now is a platform that, if we so choose, we can use as a jump off point to start to address the things that we don't agree on. But what we tend to do is the exact opposite. We tend to take those things that we agree on, like space exploration, and use them as a stick to force the things that we don't agree on. And that just never works. On the International Space Station program, there's not the US crew and the Russian crew and the Japanese crew or whoever. There's just the crew. And that's not just the crew on orbit, that's the crew in all the mission control rooms around the world. And had we not had the Russians in the International Space Station partnership, the space station would have shut down. It would have never been finished construction probably, and it would have been shut down in 2003 after the Columbia disaster. And so in that particular case, the Russians stepped up and carried the load for us for a little while. They didn't live up to what a lot of people said they would do, which was basically stick it to us because we were down. They didn't kick us when we were down. And so right now we have a situation where the Chinese want to go to the moon, the Russians want to go to the moon, and this is, again, to stay. This is not just to go, plant some flags and pick up rocks. This is a permanent human presence on the moon, which I think we should all be doing together as an international community for all the reasons that I just stated. That if we're doing this together, then we'll have insight into it. It'll be stronger because of the different perspectives that each of these partners bring. Different engineering approaches, which builds redundancy and resiliency into our programs. And again, we'll be able to understand more of the why things are happening. And I think the research centers, the research stations in the South China Sea is a perfect example. If they were truly international research centers, it would be a whole different story.
Right. Yeah, shifting gears, I want to talk a little bit and get your take on Starlink. As we think about space as the next business frontier. For our viewers that may not know, of course, this is Elon Musk, the founder of Tesla. He wants to provide these programs to provide global Wi-Fi, I guess, utilizing small miniature satellites that can be put out into space through a SpaceX program. I've extended my expertise in that field right there. But nonetheless, I do want to get your take, because as we think about, maybe different independent companies and corporations and competitors putting these mini satellites up into space, we're now capitalizing the night sky. So, are you concerned over that?
I'm concerned I'm concerned that we don't do it right. I'm a very, very strong proponent of providing internet access to every human being on the planet, and not just because it will help people who presently don't have internet access. It will help all of us. I truly believe by connecting the almost 3 billion people who don't have access to the internet right now, connecting those 3 billion problem-solving, creative, innovative minds to the global conversation will lead to solutions to our shared problems coming that we never dreamed of, coming from places we never heard of. But you bring up a really good point, Seth, is that throwing all these thousands of satellites into orbit is going to has the potential to increase the space junk problem that we have. We have a serious issue. Actually, when I was on my 6-month mission on the space station, we almost we had a really close call with a piece of space junk. That's a whole nother story, but it passed within 300 meters of us that had it hit would have demolished the entire space station. And so space junk in orbit is a very real threat. And I know Starlink has systems on board to deorbit. The issue is when these satellites go dead, what do you do with them? Do they just stay in orbit? And the Starlink satellites, and there's other groups that are trying to do this too. There's Swarm and some others that are all in low Earth orbit, right? And so eventually, if you don't continually reboost the orbit of those satellites, they do naturally come back to Earth and burn up in the atmosphere, but that could take years or decades. In the case of Starlink, they do have a system to deorbit malfunctioning satellites, but it's not as I understand it right now, it's not a redundant system. And so if you have dead satellites, dozens or hundreds of thousands of these things, all it takes is for a couple of collisions or maybe even one collision to start a chain reaction. And then all of a sudden, low Earth orbit becomes unusable, which means geosynchronous orbit is unusable because you have to get through low Earth orbit to get the geosynchronous orbit. So it's something that we really, really need to think about. You also mentioned the night sky. Having these thousands of satellites with very reflective surfaces, there's a lot of astronomers, there's a lot of scientific work that could be disrupted, and so steps need to be taken to help with that. There are things on the ground that we can use. There's filters. There's all kinds of different technology that we can use to remove that problem. But it's just things we need to think about. It's something that we need to do, but we need to do it in a smart way and in a way that balances all of these concerns.
Ron, I mean, your insight is just incredible, and we could really go on for hours here, just learning more and more. But I just want to get to this one last question, and it seems to me that the very core of the space program is about learning and developing new technology. And what we see here on Earth is that there, businesses and people making more and more use of technology, and how much it's changing our lives and changing the trajectory, let's say, of humankind. So what's your insight on the benefits and perhaps the unintended consequences of using all this technology in our daily lives?
Yeah, I think this is part of the evolution of society, and this is part of what I'm talking about in Floating in Darkness, is that we have to think about all these things, because of all technology, no matter how good its intention, can be either misused or used in nefarious ways. I mean, I think last time I checked, I think 1.1 million people die every year in automobile accidents. So the automobile is a very dangerous piece of technology, right? Does that mean we shouldn't have automobiles? The internet has changed our lives. It's improved quality of life. It's enabled businesses and industries to develop and done all this wonderful thing. But it also creates echo chambers where it gives an audience to falsehoods and conspiracy theories and all these things that are detrimental to our progress. And so I don't have a good answer right now on how we're going to navigate this, but we do need to navigate this because, it goes back to the question on Starlink and creating an internet that everybody can participate in. The benefits greatly outweigh the downside, but we need to control the downside. We need to mitigate the downside as best we can in every way possible. And I think we're doing a pretty good job, and the trajectory is taking us in a good direction. I think we need to make a couple of course corrections in the near term, in the next couple of years, to make sure that we stay on the right course in that regard. But since the advent of the first invention, it can be used for good or misused.
You're certainly spot on with that one. So, Ron, listen, on behalf of Seth and I want to thank you so much for coming on the BizPo show, and we'd like to have you back and be able to perhaps discuss in more detail Floating in Darkness, your upcoming book. So thank you for the time you spent with us, and thank you for all your service to our nation.
I appreciate that, Dan and Seth. Thank you. Thank you guys so much. It was a really enjoyable conversation.
Well, thank you, Ron. And we'll be right back. Welcome back to the BizPo Show. If you're a regular viewer, you know that Seth and I like to leave you with our final thoughts each week. So here's mine. I've been thinking about, well, space, especially with the fantastic guest that we just had on, Ron Garan. And the thought that crossed my mind, and if we look at the history of the advancement of technology, why is it that every time we make advancements, it becomes tools for war? Think about it. Why does every great scientific experiment that leads in a direction that should be better for humankind ends up being weaponized in some form or another? And I think when you have someone like Ron Garan on this show and he talks about with such passion the great things that NASA is doing and the space program and what could be better for all of us in humankind. That's really where I like to think about things. It's just that I just get a little bit bothered that somehow, sometimes, things get a little twisted and the consequences of those actions could be catastrophic.
Well, Dan, I got to tell you, I mean, listen, I thought a lot about Ron's upcoming book, Floating in Darkness, as well, and I can't wait to read it because, as he mentioned in the segment, he's talking about this kind of being an evolutionary, his life, kind of portraying kind of what we're seeing in society. To your point, my final thought kind of along those same lines, because I'd like to talk about exaggeration in the media, or said differently, conglomerates who cried wolf. There was an important story in the news recently about a man who was arrested with a rifle and ammunition outside the vice president's house. Big headline, right? Except he wasn't actually armed. He had a weapon in his car, in a parking garage, a ways away. And he also wasn't outside of Vice President Harris's house. He was outside the military base where her house will be. She actually doesn't live there yet. She lives in an entirely different part of D.C. And Metropolitan Police say that there's no indication he intended to interact with the vice president or her family. Regardless, that portion of the base is guarded by the U.S. military and Secret Service. So, my money's on them. But did this man mean to harm Vice President Harris? I don't know. That's important. But reporting the story the way they did and exaggerate what actually happened, well, this continues to erode the public's confidence in the media. So let's hope that this serves as a reminder. Take what you hear on air with several grains of salt, regardless of the source. We saw the Washington Post make up false statements attributed to President Trump that may have actually swayed voters in a razor-tight senatorial election. How dare they? It's a mockery of ethical journalism, and it belongs in a tabloid rag. And we saw nearly every mainstream news source repeat the Washington Post claims, and then just recently this week, repeat the claims of an unidentified anonymous source. They did this constantly, and they did it in black and white. Shame on them. Be responsible for your media input, media conglomerates. We on the BizPo Show represent our opinions on the news of the day, but no one source of media should be your end-all be-all for what's going on in the world. Diversify your input. If you're a conservative, maybe listen to some liberal sources every once in a while to get their take. You'll find they talk about things that conservative media may not. And if you're a liberal, maybe pick up the remote and turn it over to Newsmax or Fox News every once in a while. You'll find the same thing. We've seen all around us that we should be cautious in what we take as written in stone from the mainstream media these days. Listen, learn, but be vigilant in making sure that we aren't being pandered to, nor lied to, nor misled. We are responsible for our own education, and I thank God that we have a country so endowed with libraries and forums of free speech and the ability to increase our own personal education so that we don't always have to rely on others. So let's do that. It's a privilege denied to so many citizens of other countries around the world. We aren't denied that. And that's my final thought.
Well said, Seth. Well, that does it for this week's show. We hope you'll tell your friends about us and continue to tune in each week. From New York City, I'm Dan Geltrude.
And from Dallas, Texas, I'm Seth Denson. Good night.